In the twilight of a forgotten time, when shadows lengthen and whispers of the past still echo within the walls of history, emerges a singular voice resonating from the corners of human thought. In the profound silence of an ancestral library, where old texts whisper secrets and scrolls guard mysteries intertwined with the dust of time, lies a tome that has defied the centuries. Its cover, leather worn by history, holds within its pages the words that once shook the foundations of human knowledge. This text is more than a mere narration. It is a portal to the mind of René Descartes, a genius whose work not only revolutionized philosophy, but also opened the doors to a new era of thought. Through his Discourse on the Method, Descartes invites us on a journey where reason becomes our compass and skepticism our sword. From the illuminated halls of the wise to the dark alleys of radical questioning, accompany Descartes as he challenges preconceived ideas and constructs, step by step, the foundation of modern philosophy. In each sentence, in each argument, the mysteries of human thought are revealed, and the webs of a mind that dared to challenge even its own thoughts are woven. Prepare yourself for an experience that will challenge your intellectual boundaries and lead you to explore the deepest corners of existence. Through the guiding voice, immerse yourself in the Discourse on the Method and discover why even in the labyrinth of doubt truth can be found. Preface. The Discourse on the Method is a work of exceptional mental richness. Apart from a few dialogues by Plato, no book surpasses it in depth, variety of interests and suggestions. It inaugurates modern philosophy, opens new paths to science, illuminates the essential features of French literature and character. In short, it is the spiritual autobiography of a superior mind that embodies to the highest degree the noblest qualities of a very noble race. In this brief preface, we cannot present Descartes' thought and work in the rich diversity of its philosophical, literary, scientific, artistic, political, and even technical nuances. Therefore, we will limit ourselves for philosophy, and even within this domain to only exposing the general themes of greater historical potentiality. Cartesian thought is like the portico of modern philosophy. The characteristic features of its architecture are reproduced in broad strokes in the structure and ideological economy of subsequent systems. Descartes poses a set of problems for philosophical reflection, and philosophy endeavors to decipher them for more than a century, until a new transformation of perspective brings new speculative and practical interests to the forefront of consciousness, inaugurating new methods and orientations of thought. Kant is the one who, on the one hand, completes and closes the Cartesian cycle, and on the other hand, inaugurates a new philosophical modus operandi in the history of philosophy. It is not, as many believe, a confused and bewildering succession of doctrines, heterogeneous opinions, but a reasonable continuity of ordered surpassings. However, the great difficulty for the historian of Cartesianism is to find the link between Descartes and previous philosophy. It is not clear enough to point out literal consequences between Descartes and St. Anselm, nor to meticulously note that there were, in the 15th and 16th centuries, such and such philosopher who doubted and even praised doubt, or who made natural reason the criterion of truth, or who wrote on method, or who praised mathematics. None of this is a profound historical precedent, but at best superficial, external, verbal coincidences. In reality, Descartes, as Hamelin says, seems to come immediately after the ancients, but between Descartes and scholasticism there is a cultural fact, not only scientific, of immeasurable importance, the Renaissance. Now the Renaissance is everywhere, but presented more fully and better in philosophy. It is eminently expressed in artists, poets, scientists, theologians, in Leonardo da Vinci, in Ronsard, in Galileo, in Luther, in the Spirit. In short, which with a new comforting impetus stimulates all the forces of human production. To this spirit of the Renaissance, one must immediately refer for Cartesian philosophy. Descartes is the first philosopher of the Renaissance. The Middle Ages were certainly not a barbaric and dark era, and undoubtedly in the current judgment we pass on this period, a perspective error, or better, a vision error, arises from the fact that the bright light of the Renaissance blinds and dazzles us, preventing us from seeing what remains beyond this dawn. But it is undeniable that scientific and philosophical thought needs for its development an appropriate environment favoring free individual reflection. When an individual's consciousness is reduced to reflecting the collective consciousness of the social group, thought becomes a servant of collective dogmas. Man retreats into the higher organism of the nation or class, and the concept of the human dissolves and disappears under the weight of real hierarchies and objective impositions of society. Thus, when in the 16th century the spirit begins to free itself from the tight bonds that held it captive, this liberation appears as a discovery of man by himself, like a soldier who, after the battle amidst a pile of corpses, gradually returns to life, feels, breathes, raises his eyes, stretches his arms, and seems finally convinced of his own existence. Likewise, the Renaissance possesses the naive and joyful freshness of one who discovers himself for the first time and exclaims, "I am a being who thinks, feels, desires, loves, and hates. This nature surrounding me is beautiful and luminous, and life has been given to us by a just and benevolent God to live it with integrity and fullness." Individual consciousness is the greatest invention of the new mode of thought, and everything in science, art, and sensibility of the Renaissance is oriented towards the exaltation of human subjectivity. The criterion of authority gives way to intimate conviction based on evidence. Obscure metaphysical entities dissipate in the clear succession of mathematical reasons. Distrust and hatred towards nature are replaced by an optimistic and joyful vision of the countless benefits that arise from the spontaneous impulse towards understanding things. The universe is like a book where the supreme truth is inscribed, and to understand its language only the reason proper to man is needed, mathematics applied to experience. Thus, on the one hand, the maximum requirement of the scientific spirit in the Renaissance is the evident clarity of individual reason. On the other hand, the solidity of the new science comes above all from its mathematical and experimental character. Ultimately, the purest source of all speculative and practical value is now found in the subject, in the preeminence of personal creative reflection. All these new desires impose new directions on philosophical thought, suddenly giving it the freedom to manifest itself in an original and creative manner, but also indicating an unprecedented orientation and, so to speak, a blank problem, to find a definition of man sufficient to explain the objectivity of his scientific and artistic production. Descartes is the first to systematically build the philosophy of this new mental world. The life of Descartes. René Descartes was born in La Haye, in the village of La Haye-en-Touraine, on May 31, 1596. He belonged to a family of magistrate nobility. His father was a councillor in the Parliament of Rennes, and a love for letters was traditional in the family. Descartes recounts in the Discourse on Method, "I was raised in the cultivation of letters." Indeed, from a young age he entered the College of La Flèche, run by the Jesuits. There he received a solid classical and philosophical education, whose value and utility Descartes acknowledged several times. A certain friend asked him if it wouldn't be good to choose a Dutch university for his son's philosophical studies. Descartes replied, "Even though I do not think that everything taught in philosophy is as true as the gospel, however, being the key and fundamental science of other sciences, it is very useful to have followed the entire course of philosophy as taught by the Jesuits before applying oneself to develop one's own genius beyond pedantry and becoming a true sage." Descartes describes the philosophy course at La Flèche. The first year was devoted to the study of Aristotle's logic, where Porphyry's introduction, the categories, the treatise on interpretation, the first 5 chapters of the prior analytics, the 8 books of the topics, and finally the posterior analytics were read and commented upon, serving as the basis for a lengthy development of the theory of demonstration. Next, physics and mathematics were studied in the second year, and Aristotle's metaphysics in the third year. The lessons were divided into 2 parts. The teacher dictated and explained Aristotle or St. Thomas. Then he posed certain questions drawn from the author and subject to different interpretations. He isolated the question, defined it clearly, divided it into parts, and developed it into a large syllogism. of which he successively proved the major and minor premises. The students' exercises consisted of arguments or debates. At the end of the year, some of these contests were public. We know the name of the philosophy teacher Descartes had at La Flèche, Father François Véron. But in reality, the teaching was completely objective and impersonal. The rules of these studies were meticulously established in the orders and statutes of the company. Take great care that the masters do not deviate from Aristotle, except in matters contrary to the faith or universally received doctrines. Nothing should be defended or taught that goes against, or is different or unfavorable to the faith, both in philosophy and in theology. Nothing should be defended that goes against the axioms received by philosophers, such as the fact that there are only 4 kinds of causes, or that there are only 4 elements, etc. Such philosophical education could only awaken the desire for freedom in a mind already eager to be guided by its own convictions. Descartes clearly gives us, in the Discourse on Method, the sensation that, already in college, his philosophical works were not without certain inner reservations. His judgment on the scholastic philosophy that he had learned, as we have seen, in all its purity and rigidity, is both benevolent and radically condemnatory. He acknowledges to this philosophical education the merit of pleasing the mind and giving agility to the intellect, but he denies it any scientific efficacy. It does not teach us to discover truth, but only to plausibly defend all propositions. Descartes left La Flèche after completing his studies in 1612 with a vague but firm intention of seeking within himself what he had not been able to find in his studies. This is the characteristic trait of the Renaissance, which from the very first moment maintains and supports all the peculiarity of his thought, to find in his own understanding, in the self, the ultimate and unique reasons for his principles. Such is the objective that Descartes sets for himself. His entire psychology as an investigator is encapsulated in these sentences from the Discourse on Method. I do not boast either of being the first inventor of my opinions, but only of not having accepted them either because another said them, or because I said them myself, but only because reason convinced me of their truth. After spending a few idle years in Paris, he had the desire to travel the world and see firsthand the comedies that were being played there, but more as a spectator than as an actor. He entered into the service of Prince William of Nassau, and these were what one could call his pilgrimage years. He fought in Germany and the Netherlands, served under the Duke of Bavaria, travelled through the Netherlands, Sweden and Denmark. He recounts in the Discourse on Method how, during one of his journeys, he began to understand the foundations of the new way of philosophizing. His nature, not prone to exaltation and sentimental excess, nonetheless had to endure during those months an acute attack of enthusiasm. He had visions and heard a celestial voice entrusting him with the task of reforming philosophy. He made a vow, which he later fulfilled, to go on a pilgrimage to Our Lady of Loreto. He remained in Paris for 2 years, voluntarily participating in the Royal Army during the siege of La Rochelle, and in 1629 he put an end to this second period of his life as a soldier, traveller and observer. He then decided to devote himself definitively to meditation and study. Paris did not suit him with its many interests, friends, conversations, and visits, disturbing his solitude and retreat. He also felt with acute insight that France was not the most suitable and free place for philosophical speculations. With a sure instinct, he withdrew to Holland, where he lived for 20 years, often changing residences, hiding incognito, avoiding the idle curiosity of well-meaning and opportune friends. During these 20 years, he wrote and published his principal works, the Discourse on Method, the Dioptrics, the Meteorology, and the Geometry in 1637, the Meditations on First Philosophy in 1641. In 1647, the French translation by the Duke of Luynes, revised by Descartes, of the Principles of Philosophy. In 1644, first in Latin, then in 1647 in French, the Treatise on the Passions. His name soon became famous and his person and doctrine were quickly opposed. One of the adherents of Cartesianism, Leroy, began to expound at the University of Utrecht. The main defenders of the new philosophy protested vigorously. The Peripatetics undertook a crusade against Descartes. The rector accused Descartes of atheism and slander. The magistrates intervened by ordering the burning by the executioner of books containing the pernicious doctrine. The intervention of the French ambassador managed to stop the trial, but Descartes had to write and solicit in defense of his opinions. Even though there was ultimately an injustice, this cruel struggle, so contrary to his peaceful and tranquil nature, eventually wearied and fatigued him. He accepted the offers of Queen Christina of Sweden and arrived in Stockholm in 1649, welcomed with the greatest honors. The court gathered in the library to hear him lecture on philosophical, physical, or mathematical subjects. But Descartes enjoyed this brilliant and tranquil situation only briefly. In 1650, 1 year after his arrival in Sweden, he died, perhaps unable to withstand, due to his delicate constitution, the rigors of such a harsh climate. He was 53 years old. In 1667, his remains were transferred to Paris and buried in the church of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. A strong persecution against Cartesianism then began. On the day of the funeral, the chancellor of the university was about to deliver the eulogy of the philosopher when a higher order came forbidding any speech. Descartes' books were included in the index, although with the reservation of Don Icari Cantur. The Jesuits stirred up the Sorbonne against Descartes and asked the Parlement to proscribe his philosophy. Some well-known clergymen had to suffer greatly for their adherence to Cartesian ideas. For a long time in France, it was considered a crime to declare oneself a Cartesian. After the philosopher's death, the following were published: The World or Treatise on Light in Paris in 1677, The Letters of René Descartes on Various Subjects by Claire Sellier in Paris in 1667. In the edition of the posthumous works from Amsterdam in 1701, the unfinished treatise, The Orientation and Direction of the Brain, was published for the first time, of crucial importance for understanding the method. The origins of the method, Descartes tells us, are found in logic, geometric analysis, and algebra. It is first and foremost worth emphasizing that the serious flaw of Aristotle's logic for Descartes is its inability for invention. The syllogism cannot be a method of discovery because the premises, even if they were false, must contain the conclusion. Descartes seeks fixed rules for discovering truths, not for defending theses or expounding theories. That's why the mathematical procedure is what, from the beginning, strongly attracts his attention. This procedure is realized with the greatest clarity and efficiency in the analysis of the ancients according to Euclid. Analysis consists of admitting what is sought to be demonstrated and from there reducing through consequences the thesis to other propositions already known. Descartes also explains what analysis is in a passage from geometry. If one wants to solve a problem, one must first consider it as already solved and give names to all the lines that seem necessary for its construction, both the known and the unknown. Then, without making a distinction between the known and unknown lines, one will study the difficulty in the order that most naturally shows their mutual dependence on one another. As we can see, analysis is essentially a method of discovery, as G. said, a discovery of proof. What Descartes was primarily seeking, and which constitutes the starting point of his new method, is that the syllogism compels us to start from an established proportion of which we never know if we will be able to conclude what we want to demonstrate, unless we know in advance the truth which requires demonstration. But if we already know the conclusion in advance, it becomes clear that the syllogism serves more to expose and defend truths than to find them. Analysis is therefore the first moment of the method. Faced with a difficulty, a problem posed, it is above all necessary to consider it as a whole and to divide it into as many parts as possible, the second rule of discourse. But into how many parts to divide it? How far should the division of the difficulty go? Where should this division stop? The division should stop when we encounter an element of the problem that can be immediately known as true, and whose truth cannot be doubted. Such simple elements are clear and distinct ideas. End of the first rule. See the discourse on method. At this point, it is impossible to continue explaining Descartes' method without indicating certain principles of his theory of knowledge and his metaphysics. In the first rule of discourse, some of the most essential theories of Cartesian philosophy are summarized, even compressed. We will briefly enumerate them. First, the rule proposes evidence as the criterion of truth. The true is the evident, and the evident is defined in turn by two essential notes: clarity and distinctness. An idea is clear when it is separated and known separately from other ideas. An idea is distinct when its parts or components are separated from each other and known with inner clarity. It must be noted that for Descartes, the truth or falsehood of an idea does not reside, as for the scholastics, in correspondence or conformity with the thing. Indeed, existing things are not given in themselves, but as ideas or representations to which we suppose correspond external realities to the self. But the material of knowledge is never other than ideas of different classes, and therefore the criterion of truth of ideas cannot be extrinsic but must be inherent to the ideas themselves. Modern philosophy begins with Descartes in idealism, encompassing the world in the subject and transforming things into ideas. A fundamental problem of Cartesian philosophy will be to move out of the self and move from ideas to things. In the orientation and direction of the brain, Descartes calls clear and distinct ideas simple natures. The act of the mind that learns and knows simple natures is institution or immediate knowledge, or as he also says in the Meditations, second meditation, an introspection of the mind. This operation of knowing the evident or intuiting the simple nature is the first and fundamental of knowledge. The procedures of the method will thus begin by attaining this intuition of the simple, the clear, and the distinct. The first two rules are intended for this, while the following two refer, on the other hand, to the connection or linkage of institutions, what Descartes calls deduction. For Descartes, deduction is an enumeration or succession of intuitions through which we pass from one evident truth to another until we arrive at the one we want to demonstrate. Here applies the complement, and as the definitive form of analysis. Analysis has broken down the complex difficulty into simple elements or natures. By traversing these elements and their composition, we return, proof after proof, to the original difficulty in all its complexity. But this time we return knowing, that is, by including one by one the clear ideas, the ultimate guarantee of the truth of the whole. To know is to learn, through an infallible intuition, the simple natures and the relations between them, which are themselves simple natures. Metaphysics, the notion of method, the theory of knowledge, and metaphysics are intimately linked and fused in Descartes' philosophy. The fundamental idea of the unity of human knowledge, which Descartes also presents in the form of a connected and chained geometry, is the one that brings together all these elements, bringing metaphysics together with logic, and the latter in turn with physics and psychology, into a grand system of linked truths. Spinoza, the Cartesian, succeeded in exposing Descartes' philosophy in a geometric series of axioms, definitions, and theorems. The starting point is methodical doubt. Cartesian doubt is not skepticism, but a dialectical process of investigation aimed at detaching and isolating the first evident truth, the first clear and distinct idea, the first simple nature. Doubt is therefore the application to the problem of knowledge of the method of analysis that we have described. The result of the analysis is the fundamental truth that serves as the basis for all others. I am a thinking thing or substance. Among the difficulties posed by methodical doubt, we will dwell on only one, the famous hypothesis of the evil genius or malicious demon. After examining the various reasons to doubt everything, the mathematical truth still stands so simple, clear, and evident that it seems that doubt cannot reach them. But Descartes also rejects them, arguing that an omnipotent God might perhaps manipulate the world with such malignancy and cunning that he would take pleasure in deceiving me, and playing tricks on me even in the things that seem most evident to me. This hypothesis has been interpreted in various ways, describing it as fanciful or superfluous, assuming that Descartes said it in jest and without believing it. Others, on the contrary, consider it very serious and strong, to the point that they believe it contains the spirit of a doubt so definitive that it is impossible to escape it without contradiction. In reality, the hypothesis of the evil genius is neither a joke nor an iron circle, but a very important dialectical movement in the course of Cartesian thought. It seems to me that the hypothesis of the evil genius needs to be destroyed, the demonstration of the existence of God. Only when we know that God exists and that God is incapable of deceiving us is the last and powerful reason put forward by Descartes to justify doubt destroyed. What does this mean? It means the presentation and solution of a serious logical problem that will deeply concern Kant, the problem of the rationality or non-rationality of the real. The evil genius and its deceptive artifices symbolize deep doubt. In general, is science possible? Is the real rationally visible, not something completely impenetrable to human reason, something essentially absurd and rationally unknowable? This question is one that Descartes poses under the dialectical guise of the hypotheses of the evil genius, and the demonstrations of the existence and truth of God only respond by affirming the rationality of knowledge, the possibility of knowledge, the ultimate confidence we must have in our reason, and the ability of objects to be apprehended by it. The first foundation of Cartesian philosophy is cogito ergo sum. Two observations on this first link in the chain. Cogito is neither a reasoning nor an intuition. The intuition of the self as the first reality and as a thinking reality is the simple nature that presents itself before any other to my knowledge, and the act by which the mind knows the simple natures is, as we have already said, an intuition. Therefore, one is mistaken when considering cogito as a syllogism. The following: everything that thinks exists, therefore I think, therefore I exist. Descartes, by founding his philosophy on the self, satisfies the essential tendency of a new philosophical sense that manifests itself in the Renaissance. It was about rationally explaining the universe, that is, explaining it in terms of man, in terms of the self. It was therefore necessary to begin by defining man, the self, and defining in such a way that it contains the sufficient elements to build a system of the world. Modern philosophy with Descartes enters its idealistic and rationalistic phase. Our philosopher's successors will fundamentally endeavor to develop these seeds of idealism, that is, to define reason as the set of necessary and sufficient logical principles and axioms to account for experience. Having found the first truth, Descartes hastens to derive from it all possible profit. The cogito is, on the one hand, the first known existence or substance, the first simple nature, and on the other hand, it is also the first intuition, the first act of true knowledge. From the cogito, therefore, can stem the criterion of all truth, namely that every intuition of simple nature is true, or in other words, that every clear and distinct idea is true. With this meager foundation, Descartes immediately approaches the supreme problem of metaphysics, the existence of God. Among the three proofs he presents, two in the third and one in the fifth meditation, we will focus only on the third given in the fifth meditation. It is the very famous ontological argument. The scheme of the demonstration is as follows. Existence is a perfection. God possesses all perfections. Therefore, God possesses existence. As we see, Descartes considers the existence of God as sure and evidently demonstrated as the property of a triangle, to have three right angles. He will go on to influence all of 17th and 18th century metaphysics, mesmerized by geometry, wanting to be more geometric, and relying more or less implicitly on the Cartesian argument. Just as the existence of the self was established in the cogito by an intellectual intuition, so the existence of God is established in the ontological argument through a deduction that, for Descartes, is a series of intellectual intuitions. The metaphysics of Cartesianism and subsequent philosophies inevitably tend to demonstrate existences through subjective intellectual acts. Indeed, starting from the self, that is, personal intelligence as the starting point, they cannot consider reality outside the self as given and must infer or show them, as intelligence immediately knows essences, definitions, but not existences, external things. Existences are always in rationalism inferred by essences. This definition will suffice for Kant to ruin all Cartesian metaphysics and open a new course for philosophy. It will suffice, I say, to distinguish essence or definition from existence. Essence may be the object of intellectual knowledge, but existence can only be by sensible knowledge. To know an existence, a non-intellectual but sensible intuition will be necessary. The cogito and the ontological argument may serve to institute ideas, but not existing things. The physics of the existence of God and his properties already derives from Descartes. Ultimately, the reality of his simple natures, in general, and therefore mathematical objects, space, figure, number, duration, movement, leads to physics. It actually begins with the essential distinction between soul and body. The soul is defined by thought, the body is defined by extension. Everything that happens in the body as a body can and must be explained with the sole elements of extension, figure, and movement. We must therefore consider two parts in Cartesian physics. One deals with events in bodies, mechanics, and the other attempts to define the substance of bodies, the theory of matter. Descartes' physics, as everyone knows, is mechanistic. Descartes wants no more elements to explain phenomena and their relationships than matter and movement. Everything is mechanistic, and in mechanics itself, everything is geometric, as demanded by the fundamental principle of clear ideas, which naturally excludes any consideration more or less mysterious in entities or qualities. Descartes' physics is a mechanics of pure quantity. Movement is stripped of anything that attains the clarity and purity of the notion. It is a simple variation of position, without anything dynamic inside, without any idea of effort or action, that Descartes rejects as obscure and incomprehensible. The cause of movement is twofold: a first cause that generally created and introduced it into matter, and this cause is God. Once the movement is introduced into matter, God no longer intervenes, except to continue to maintain matter in its being. From this it follows that the quantity of movement existing in the system of the world is variable and constant. But for each movement in particular, there is a particular cause which is only a case of the laws of movement. These laws are three. The first is the law of inertia, a beautiful discovery by Descartes, which, even if he had made no other discoveries, would suffice to place him among the founders of modern science. The second is that of the direction of movement. A moving body tends to communicate it in a straight line according to the tangent or curve that the moving object discovers. The third law is that of the collision, which Descartes specifies in other special laws. All are false. Descartes' mechanics, while profound and exact in its first two principles, deviates and distorts the last one, precisely due to the excess of geometry with which it conceives movement. The fundamental correction missing in Descartes' physics is well known. It is not the quantity of movement that is constant in nature, but energy. But Descartes, in his desire to admit only clear notions, considers the notions of energy or force as incomprehensible because they are not geometrically representable, and rejects them to limit himself to conceiving pure geometric extension in matter. We thus arrive at the second part of physics, the theory of matter. Here the same spirit dominates, as in mechanics. Matter is nothing but space, pure extension, the very object of geometry. The secondary qualities that we perceive in sensible objects are intellectually inconceivable and therefore do not belong to reality. Color, taste, smell, etc. Matter reduces to extension in latitude and depth, with its modes which are the figures or limits of one extension by another. In psychology, man is composed of a body intimately linked to the soul, a thinking substance. This union, as well as the distinction between body and soul, dominates all psychological theses. We must, on the one hand, consider the soul by itself, and then, insofar as it is united to the body. In itself, the soul is intelligence, the faculty of thinking, of verifying intellectual intuitions. At this stage, psychology merges with metaphysics or logic. On the other hand, among the soul's ideas are its desires, the will or freedom, placing it on the same level as other intellectual intuitions. The will is the wholly formal faculty of affirming or denying, and the will plays such an important role in the theory of error that it stems from the fact that, the soul being infinite and devoid of content, it sometimes hastily affirms the reality of a confused idea, or denies that of a clear idea, and in both cases causes error. Next, we must consider the soul as united to the body. In this sense, the soul is primarily a consequence, that is, it knows what happens to the body and becomes aware of this knowledge. But as the body is a mechanism, if there is no soul, there will be neither consciousness nor will nor reason. Thus, animals are only automatons, marvelously assembled machines, but totally devoid of what we can call spirit. In contrast, man, because he has an intelligent and rational soul, has passions, meaning that the body's movements are reflected in the soul, and this reflection is precisely what we call passion. This is only a special state of the soul resulting from movements of the body. But what is characteristic of these special states of the soul is that although they are actually caused by movements of the body, the soul relates them to itself, ignoring the cause of its passions. The soul believes them to be born and nurtured within itself. There are 6 fundamental passions. The first, admiration, is barely a passion and marks the transition between pure intellectual intuition and proper passion. It is essentially intellectual emotion from which arise love, hatred, desire, joy, sadness. From these 6 fundamental passions stem many others: esteem, contempt, compassion, etc. The study of passions, since they arise from movements of the body, leads Descartes to a great number of psychophysiological observations. In the first part, common sense is what is best distributed among everyone, because each thinks they possess such a good supply of it, that even the most dissatisfied generally do not desire more than what they already have, which does not seem likely that all are mistaken, but rather that it shows that the faculty of judging and distinguishing true from false, what we properly call common sense or reason, is naturally in every man, and therefore that the diversity of our opinions does not arise from some being more reasonable than others, but only that we direct our thoughts along different paths and do not consider the same things. Indeed, it is not enough to have a good mind. The essential thing is to apply it well. The greatest souls are capable of the greatest vices as well as the greatest virtues, and those who advance slowly may go much further if they always follow the straight path than those who run but deviate from it. For my part, I have never claimed to possess a more perfect mind than ordinary minds. I have often wished to have a thought as quick, or an imagination as clear and distinct, or a memory as vast and present as some others. I know of no other qualities than those which contribute to the perfection of the mind, for concerning reason or common sense, being the only thing that makes us human and distinguishes us from animals, I want to believe that it is present in each of us, and follow in this the opinion of philosophers, who say that more or less is only accidents, but not the forms or natures of individuals of the same species. But without fear, I can say that I believe it was a great adventure for me to have embarked, from my young age, on certain paths that led me to certain considerations and maxims with which I formed a method in which it seems that I have a month to gradually increase my knowledge and elevate it gradually to the highest point that the mediocrity of my mind and the brevity of my life can allow to reach. For I have already gathered such fruits from this method that even when I pass judgment on myself, I always try to lean towards distrust rather than presumption. And although, in examining with a philosophical attitude the various actions and enterprises of men, there is almost none that seems to me vain and useless, this nevertheless does not cease to produce in me an extreme satisfaction of the progress that I think I have made in the search for truth. And I have such hopes for the future, that if among the occupations that absorb purely human beings, there is one that is solidly good and important, I dare to believe that it is the one I have chosen as my own. Nevertheless, it may be that I am mistaken, and perhaps what seems to me to be pure gold and fine diamond is only a little copper and dry glass. We are exposed to deceive ourselves when it comes to ourselves, and also suspect should be the judgments of friends who speak in our favor. But I would like to make known in this present discourse the path I have followed and represent my life as in a picture, so that everyone can form their own opinion. And thus, by becoming aware through public rumor of the opinions expressed, it may be a new means of instructing myself, which I will add to those I am accustomed to using. My intention is not to teach here the method that everyone should follow to properly direct their reason, but only to expose the way in which I have tried to guide mine. Those who undertake to give precepts must consider themselves weaker than those to whom they give them, and they are very blameworthy if they fail in the least thing. But as I propose this text only as a story, or if you prefer, a fable, in which among the examples that may be imitated, there may also be others that will not be followed rightly, I hope it will be useful to some without being harmful to anyone, and that everyone will appreciate my candor. In my childhood I was brought up in the study of letters, and as I was assured that through them one could acquire a clear and sure knowledge of everything useful in life, I felt a keen desire to learn them. But as soon as I finished the course of studies, the end of which was to introduce me into the number of learned men, I completely changed my mind. I found myself involved in so many doubts and errors that it seemed to me that in seeking to instruct myself, I had obtained no benefit except to discover each time more of my ignorance. Yet I was in one of the most famous schools in Europe, where I thought there must be learned men, if there were any on earth. There, I had learned everything that others learned, and even, not content with the sciences that were taught to us, I had gone through all the books that could fall into my hands, relating to the sciences considered the most curious and rare. Furthermore, I knew the judgments that were made about me, and I did not see that I was esteemed less than my comrades, among whom some were already destined to occupy the positions that our masters would leave vacant. Finally, it seemed to me that our century was as flourishing and fertile in good minds as any of the preceding ones. Everything for which I allowed myself to judge others through myself, and to think that there was no doctrine in the world like the one that had been promised to me previously. Nevertheless, I did not stop greatly valuing the exercises practiced in schools. I knew that the languages learned in these places are necessary to understand the ancient books, that the beauty of fables awakens the mind, that the memorable actions recounted in histories elevate it, and that read with discernment they help to form judgment. The reading of all good books is like a conversation with the best minds of past centuries who composed them, and even like a studied conversation in which they only reveal to us the choicest of their thoughts. Eloquence possesses incomparable strengths and beauties. Poetry has delicacies and sweetness that delight. Mathematics has subtle inventions that can be very useful, both to satisfy the curious and to facilitate the arts and lighten the work of men. The writings that deal with customs contain several teachings and exhortations to virtue, all very useful. Theology teaches how to gain heaven. Philosophy provides means of speaking plausibly about all things, and recommends being admired by the less learned. Jurisprudence, medicine, and other sciences bring riches to those who cultivate them. Finally, it is good to have gone through all these things, even the most superstitious and false, to know their true value and not be deceived by them. However, I also believed that I had devoted enough time to languages, even to the reading of ancient books, to their histories and their fables. For it is almost the same thing to converse with people from other times as to travel in foreign lands. It is good to know a little of the customs of other peoples to judge one's own more fairly, and not to believe that everything contrary to our ways is ridiculous and opposed to reason, as those who have seen nothing often do. But he who spends too much time traveling ends up becoming a stranger in his own country. He who studies with too great curiosity what was done in past centuries generally ends up remaining ignorant of what is practiced today. Furthermore, fables are the cause of our imagining possible events that are not, and even the most faithful histories, assuming they do not change or add value to things to make them more worthy of being read, omit at least almost always the lowest and least illustrious circumstances. It follows that what remains does not appear as it is, and those who adjust their customs to the examples they draw from histories expose themselves to falling into the extravagances of the knights of our romances, or to conceiving designs beyond their strength. I held eloquence in great esteem and was enamored of poetry, but I thought that both are gifts of the mind rather than fruits of study. Those who have a more solid capacity for reasoning and better direct their thoughts to make them clear and intelligible are the most capable of convincing minds of what they propose, even if they speak in a mediocre language and have never learned rhetoric. And those who imagine the most pleasant inventions, knowing how to express them with more grace and sweetness, will always be the best poets, even if they are ignorant of poetic art. I loved mathematics above all for the certainty and evidence possessed by their reasoning, but I did not yet understand their true use, and I thought they served only for the mechanical arts. It did not surprise me that, their foundations being so solid, nothing higher had been built upon them. On the other hand, I compared the writings of the ancient pagans relating to customs to very sumptuous and magnificent palaces, but built on sand and mud. They extol virtues greatly and present them as the most estimable things in the world, but they do not teach us sufficiently how to practice them, and sometimes attribute this beautiful name to what is nothing but insensitivity, pride, despair, or parricide. I professed a great veneration for our theology, and like anyone else, I claimed to seek heaven. But having learned, as it is very certain, that the path to salvation is as open to the ignorant as to the learned, and that the revealed truths that lead to it are far beyond our understanding, I would never have dared to subject them to the weaknesses of my reasoning, thinking that it was necessary, in order to undertake the task of examining them and emerging victorious, to have extraordinary help from heaven, and to be something more than a man. I will say nothing about philosophy except that, seeing it cultivated by the most excellent minds who have lived over the centuries, and yet nothing in it escapes disputes and therefore uncertainty, I did not presume to succeed better than others. Considering how diverse opinions on the same subject can be, all supported by learned people, though only one can be true, I held almost everything that was merely plausible to be almost false. As for the other sciences, since they derive their principles from philosophy, I thought that on such fragile foundations nothing solid could be built. Neither the honor nor the profit they promise sufficed to motivate me to learn them, for I found myself, thanks to God, in a condition that did not require me to make science a profession to improve my fortune. Even though I did not profess to despise glory in a cynical manner, I had no need for that renown, whose acquisition can only be achieved by false pretenses. Finally, as for false doctrines, I thought I knew enough about them not to be deceived by the promises of an alchemist, the predictions of an astrologer, the deceptions of a magician, or the claims of those who pretend to know more than they do. Thus, as soon as I reached the age to leave the tutelage of my preceptors, I completely abandoned the study of letters. Resolved to seek no other knowledge than that which I could find within myself or in the great book of the world, I spent the rest of my youth traveling, observing courts and armies, cultivating the society of people of various conditions and humors, gathering various experiences, testing myself in the circumstances that fortune presented to me, and always drawing such lessons from the things that presented themselves to me that I could profit from them. Indeed, it seemed to me that I could find much more truth in the reasonings that each person makes concerning matters that concern them, exposed to the possibility of being chastised by success if they have judged badly, than in those made by a scholar in his study about speculations that have no effect and for which he has no other consequence than perhaps being more susceptible to pride as they deviate further from common sense, since he will have had more ingenuity and artifice to try to make them plausible. I always had an extreme desire to learn to distinguish the true from the false, to see clearly in my actions, and to walk safely in this life. It is true that, as long as I confined myself to considering the customs of other men, I found little that was sure and firm, and I observed almost as much diversity as I had previously noticed in the opinions of philosophers. Thus, the greatest benefit I derived from it was that, seeing many things that, although they seemed very extravagant and ridiculous to me, were nevertheless commonly accepted and approved by other great nations, I learned not to believe too firmly in what had only been persuaded to me by human example, and thus I gradually freed myself from many errors that obscure our natural light and make us less capable of hearing the voice of reason. But when I had spent several years studying the book of the world and seeking to acquire some experience, I resolved one day to also study within myself and to employ all the forces of my mind to choose the path I should follow. This succeeded much better for me, I believe, than if I had never left my homeland and my books. I was then in Germany, where wars that are not yet finished had called me, and returning from the coronation of the emperor to the army, I was caught by the beginning of winter, in a place where, finding no conversation to divert me, and fortunately having no worries or passions to trouble my mind. I remained all day alone, shut up in a stove-heated room, with all the tranquility necessary to give myself over to my reflections, among which one of the first was to consider how often it happens that in many works composed of various pieces and made by the hands of several masters, there is not as much perfection as in those in which one alone has worked. Thus, we see that buildings begun and completed by a single architect are usually more beautiful and better ordered than those where several have had a part and have tried to arrange them, employing old walls made for other uses. These old towns, which were initially only villages and have over time become large cities, are generally very poorly built and irregular. If we compare them to other places that an engineer designs according to his fancy on a plane, although considering their buildings one by one, we often find much more art in them than in those of the newly planned towns. Yet seeing how they are arranged with a large building here, a small one there, and how the streets are curved and uneven, one would think it is more the work of chance than of the will of men endowed with reason who arranged them. And if one considers that nevertheless there have always been officers charged with ensuring that private buildings serve as public ornaments, one will recognize how difficult it is to carry out things successfully when working on projects completed by others. I also thought that those ancient peoples, half wild, gradually evolved by civilizing their laws, conforming as the necessities due to crimes and disputes compelled them. They cannot be as well constructed as those who, from their very formation, have observed the constitutions of a wise legislator. Likewise, it is entirely true that the state of the true religion, whose ordinances were instituted by God alone, must be incomparably better arranged than all the others. Speaking of human affairs, I believe that if Sparta was once very flourishing, it was not due to the goodness of each of its laws individually, some of which were very strange and even contrary to good customs, but because having been devised by a single individual, they all aimed at the same goal. Thus, I thought that the science of books, at least that whose reasonings are only probable and lack demonstrations, having been gradually constituted by the opinions of different people, is not as close to the truth as the simple reasonings that a person of good sense can naturally have about the things that present themselves. I also thought that, as we have all been children before becoming men, we must have for a long time been guided by our appetites and our tutors, often opposed to each other, and neither always advising us for the best. It is almost impossible that our judgments are as pure and solid as if they had been guided from our birth by our fully developed reason, and never influenced by anything else. That is why we do not see all the houses of a city being demolished solely to rebuild them differently and make the streets more beautiful, but we see many individuals ordering the demolition of their houses to rebuild them, and often they are encouraged to do so when the buildings are likely to collapse because their foundations are not solid enough. Observing this, I persuaded myself that it would not be prudent for an individual to truly undertake to reform a state by completely changing it from its foundations, demolishing it to straighten it out. Even reforming the body of sciences or the established order in schools for teaching them would be a very delicate task. As for the opinions to which I had previously given credit, I could do nothing better than to undertake immediately to eliminate them in order to replace them afterwards with better ones, or with the same ones once I had adjusted them to the level of reason. I was firmly convinced that in this way I could guide my life much better than if I simply built upon old foundations, relying only on the principles I had learned in my youth without having examined them to know if they were true. For although I saw several difficulties in this endeavor, they were not insurmountable, nor comparable to those encountered in the reform of small things that concern the public. For these great political bodies, it is very difficult to raise them once they have been demolished, or even to keep them standing when they totter. Their collapses are necessarily very violent. Moreover, regarding their imperfections, they exist, and the mere diversity among them is enough to ensure that many have them. Usage has greatly softened them, undoubtedly. Many have been avoided or corrected insensibly, and not a little thanks to prudence which could not have remedied them as effectively otherwise. Finally, they are almost always more tolerable than their change would be, just as the royal roads that wind through the mountains gradually become so flat and comfortable due to the heavy traffic that it is better to follow them than to try to bypass them by climbing over rocks and descending to the bottoms of the peaks. For all these reasons, I cannot in any way commend those restless and hasty men who, without being called by their lineage or their fortune to deal with public affairs, never cease to conceive new reforms. If I believed that this writing contained the slightest thing that could render me suspect of this madness, I would not have consented to its publication. My intentions have never been other than to attempt to reform my own thoughts and to build upon a ground that belongs to me alone. If I have sufficiently appreciated my work, and if I show you here the model, it is not to advise anyone to imitate me. Those who have received greater and more abundant favors from God will undoubtedly have higher aspirations than mine, but I greatly fear that mine may be too bold for some people. The simple resolution to rid oneself of all previously received opinions is not an example that everyone should follow. The world is composed almost entirely of two kinds of minds to whom this example is by no means suitable. These are those who, believing themselves more skillful than they are, cannot contain the haste of their judgments, nor have enough patience to orderly conduct all their thoughts, which makes it so that once they have taken the liberty of doubting the principles they have received and deviating from the common path, they can never stay on the right track to go more directly and will remain lost all their lives. There are also those who, having enough reason or modesty to judge that they are less capable of distinguishing the true from the false than other people from whom they could receive instruction, prefer to content themselves with following the opinions of these people, rather than seeking better ones on their own. I would certainly have belonged to this latter category of minds if I had had only one master in my life, and if I had not known how different the opinions of the most learned have been at all times. Having learned in school that one cannot imagine anything so strange, however unbelievable, that has not been said by some philosopher, and having then observed in my travels that all those who think differently from us are not for that reason barbarous or savage, but that many of them make as much or more use of reason than we do. Having also considered that the same man, with the same mind, if he has been brought up among the French or the Germans since childhood, becomes very different from what he would have been if he had lived among the Chinese or the cannibals. Even in the fashion of our clothes, what pleased us 10 years ago and may again please us in 10 years now seems extravagant and ridiculous. Thus it is more custom and example that persuade us than any certain knowledge. However, the multitude of voices is not a valid proof for truths that are somewhat difficult to discover, for it is more likely that a single man will reach them than an entire people. I could not choose a person whose opinions seemed preferable to those of others. I was thus forced to undertake the task of guiding myself, but like a man who must walk alone and in the dark, resolving to go so slowly and with so much circumspection in everything, that rather than advancing little, I would at least guard myself against falling or stumbling. I did not even want to begin to rid myself completely of any of the opinions that might have previously infiltrated my belief without having been introduced by reason, before I had dedicated a good amount of time to the project of the work I was going to undertake, seeking the whole truth to reach the knowledge of all things of which my mind was capable. When I was younger, I had studied the parts of philosophy, logic, and mathematics, the analysis of geometry and algebra, the essential arts or sciences that seemingly contributed something to my goal. But when I examined them, I noticed that regarding logic, its syllogisms and most of the other instructions it provides are more useful for explaining to others things that are already known, or even Lull's art of speaking without judgment about unknown things, than for learning them. Although they contain many very good and true precepts, they are nevertheless mixed with so many other harmful or superfluous precepts that it is almost as difficult to separate them as to extract a Diana or a Minerva from a block of marble without devastation. As for the analysis of the ancients and the algebra of the moderns, aside from what concerns only abstract matters that seem to be of no utility, the former is so constrained to consider figures that it cannot exercise the understanding without greatly tiring the imagination. As for the latter, its practitioners have become so attached to certain rules and formulas that they have turned it into a confusing and obscure art. I thought that a method should be sought other than that of cultivating the intellect in a science, thus combining the advantages of these three methods, while excluding their defects. Just as a multitude of laws often serves as an excuse for vices, a state is much better governed when there are few laws but they are strictly observed. Therefore, instead of the large number of precepts contained in logic, I thought that the following 4 would suffice for me, provided I firmly and constantly resolved never to deviate from them even once. The first was to accept nothing as true unless I clearly and distinctly recognized it to be so, that is, to avoid carefully all haste and prejudice, and to include in my judgments nothing more than what presented itself so clearly to my mind that there was no reason to doubt it. The second was to divide each difficulty I had to examine into as many parts as possible and as necessary to resolve it better. The third was to conduct my thoughts in an orderly manner, starting with the simplest and easiest objects to know, and gradually ascending to the knowledge of the more complex ones, even assuming an order among those that do not naturally precede one another. The last was to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general in all cases that I would be sure to omit nothing. These long chains of reasonings, simple and easy, which geometers customarily use to arrive at their most difficult demonstrations, had given me the occasion to imagine that all things that can fall within human knowledge follow one another in the same manner, and that, abstaining from accepting any as true that were not, and always keeping to the order necessary to deduce one from another, there could be nothing so remote that it would be beyond our reach or too hidden that it could not be discovered. I did not spend much time in seeking out where to begin, as I already knew it had to be with the simplest and easiest things to know. Considering that among those who have sought the truth in the sciences, only the mathematicians had been able to find any demonstrations, that is, certain and evident reasons, I did not doubt that I had to start with the very same ones they examined, even though I did not hope to gain any other advantage from this than to accustom my mind to be satisfied with clear and certain truths, and not be content with false reasoning. This did not mean that I intended to learn all those specific sciences commonly called mathematics, seeing that although their objects were different, they all nonetheless studied the various relationships or proportions found in those objects. I thought it would be better to examine these proportions in general. I assumed them only in subjects that could make their knowledge easier, and did not attach them in any way to those subjects, so that I could apply them more freely to all other subjects to which they might be suitable. I then realized that to know them, I would sometimes need to consider each one individually, and at other times to retain or understand several together. I thought that to examine them better individually, I should suppose them in lines, for I found nothing simpler or more capable of being represented clearly to my imagination and senses. But to retain or understand several together, it was necessary to explain them with the fewest numbers possible. Thus, I took the best aspects of geometric analysis and algebra, and corrected all the defects of the one by the other. Indeed, I dare say that the exact observation of the few precepts I have chosen has given me such ease in unraveling all the questions treated by these two sciences that in the 2 or 3 months I spent examining them, starting with the simplest and most general, and each truth I found becoming a rule that subsequently served me to find others, not only did I succeed in solving several problems I had previously considered very difficult, but it even seemed to me towards the end that even for those I was ignorant of, I could determine by what means and to what extent it was possible to resolve them. This might not be seen as excessive vanity if one considers that, since there is only one truth for each thing, whoever finds it knows all that can be known about it. For example, a child who knows arithmetic and performs a calculation correctly can be sure of having found all that human ingenuity can find regarding that calculation. Because in the end, the method I have taught to follow the true order and carefully review all the circumstances of what one is seeking contains what confers certainty to the rules of arithmetic. But what satisfied me most about this method was the assurance of using my reason for everything, if not perfectly, at least as well as possible, and the fact that its application allowed me to gradually conceive of objects with more clarity and distinction. Not having confined this method to any particular domain, I had promised myself to apply it with the same success to the difficulties of other sciences as I had done for algebra. Nevertheless, I did not dare to immediately start examining all these sciences presented to me, as that would have been contrary to the order prescribed by the method. Having noticed that the principles of the sciences must all be derived from philosophy, in which I found none that were certain, I thought it was necessary first to try to establish some. Knowing that this was the most important thing in the world, and that it required the greatest caution and avoidance of haste, I decided not to undertake this task until I reached a more mature age than the 23 years I had then. I spent a good amount of time preparing by eliminating from my mind all the erroneous opinions I had received before that time and gathering different experiences that would later serve as material for my reasoning. Finally, I worked relentlessly on the method I had prescribed to myself to solidify it in my mind. In the end, to begin rebuilding the dwelling where one lives, it is not enough to have demolished it and gathered materials and architects, or even to have acquired experience in architecture oneself and carefully drafted plans for the new building. One must also foresee another dwelling where one can comfortably reside while the work lasts. Thus, to avoid being irresolute in my actions, while reason obliged me to be so in my judgments, and to continue living as happily as possible, I arranged for myself a provisional moral code consisting of only 3 or 4 maxims, which I am happy to share with you. The first was to follow the laws and customs of my country, always maintaining the religion in which the grace of God had instructed me since my childhood. For everything else, I was to guide myself by the most moderate opinions, avoiding all extremes which were commonly accepted in practice by the most sensible among those with whom I had to live. Having begun by not relying at all on my own opinions, thinking of subjecting all opinions to a new examination, I was sure there was nothing better than following the most sensible ones. Even though there may be men as sensible among the Persians and Chinese as among us, it seemed more useful to adapt to those with whom I had to live. To know what their true opinions were, it was better to trust what they did rather than what they said, not only because, given the corruption of our customs, few people consent to say what they truly believe, but also because many are unaware of it. For the act of thinking, by which one believes something, is different from that by which one knows that one believes it. Therefore, it often happens that the second case occurs, and among several equally accepted opinions, I chose the most moderate ones, not only because they are always the most convenient for practice, and probably the best, since all excess is generally bad, but also to avoid straying too far from the true path in case of error. For if I had chosen one of the extremes, I would then have had to follow the other. I particularly considered any promise that deprived one of a part of one's liberty to be an excess. Not that I disapprove of laws that, to remedy the inconstancy of weak minds, allow for making vows or contracts obliging one to persist in a good intention, even for the security of indifferent matters. But I saw nothing in the world that remains always in the same state. As for myself, I hoped to improve my judgments more and more. I would have considered myself guilty of a grave mistake against common sense if the mere fact of approving something at one time obliged me to consider it good at another, when perhaps it would have ceased to be so, or I would have ceased to regard it as such. My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute as possible in my actions, and to remain as constant in my opinions, even the most doubtful ones, once I had decided on them, as if they were the most certain. In this, I followed the steps of those who are lost in a forest. They should not wander by turning in circles or stopping in one place, but walk as straight as possible towards a fixed point without changing direction for trivial reasons, even if it was only chance that initially determined this course. For in this way, even if they do not reach exactly where they want to go, they will eventually arrive somewhere better than the middle of the forest. Thus, since the actions of life often do not tolerate delay, it is truly the case that if we are not in a position to discern the best opinions, we must follow the most probable ones. And even if we find no more probability in some than in others, we must nevertheless decide on certain ones, and regard them afterward, not as doubtful for the sake of practice, but as true and very certain, because the reason that determined us so is. And this has been enough to free me from then on from all the remorse and repentance that often trouble the consciences of weak and wavering minds that shift from one thing to another, first thinking they are doing well, only to later judge it poorly. My third maxim was always to conquer myself rather than fortune, and to change my desires rather than the order of the world. And in general, to accustom myself to believe that there is nothing entirely in our power except our thoughts. Thus, after having done our best concerning external things, whatever is lacking in the result is absolutely impossible for us, and this alone seemed sufficient to prevent me from desiring what I could not obtain, thus making me content. For just as our will naturally determines itself to desire only what our understanding presents to it in some way as possible, it is clear that if we consider all the goods outside us as equally inaccessible to our power, we will not feel any pain for their absence. In the same way that we feel indifferent to not possessing the kingdoms of China or Mexico, and by doing so, as it is said, making a virtue of necessity, we will not feel greater desires to be in good health when we are sick, or to be free when we are imprisoned, than we now feel for possessing bodies made of incorruptible matter like diamonds or wings to fly like birds. But I confess that it takes long exercises and many repetitions to accustom oneself to view things in this way, and I believe that this was mainly the secret of those philosophers who formerly were able to escape the empire of fortune, and despite suffering and poverty, rival even the gods. For tirelessly occupied in considering the limits prescribed by nature, they so perfectly persuaded themselves that nothing was in their power except their own thoughts, that this sufficed to prevent them from desiring other things, and they disposed of these thoughts so absolutely that they had some reason to consider themselves richer, more powerful, freer, and happier than any other men. Those who, lacking this philosophy, even if nature and fortune favor them greatly, can never have everything they want. Finally, as a conclusion to this moral code, it occurred to me to consider one by one the various occupations to which men devote their lives, to try to choose the best one. Without wanting to say anything about the others, I thought that I could do nothing better than to continue in the same path, that is, to devote my entire life to cultivating my reason and advancing as much as possible in the knowledge of the truth according to the method I had prescribed for myself. I had felt an extreme satisfaction since I started using this method, and I didn't think I could experience another one sweeter and more fulfilling in this life. Every day, with its help, I discovered some truths that seemed quite important and generally unknown to other men. This satisfaction filled my mind so much that everything else became indifferent to me. Moreover, the 3 previous maxims were based solely on the intention I had to continue educating myself. For after obtaining a little light to discern the true from the false, I would not have thought for a single moment that I should be content with the opinions of others if I did not intend to use my own judgment to examine them when the time came. And I would not have been able to rid myself of my scruples in following them if it weren't for the prospect of taking every opportunity to find better ones, if there were any. Finally, I wouldn't have known how to limit my desires and be satisfied if I hadn't followed a path that, while guaranteeing the acquisition of all the knowledge I could, also allowed me, in the same manner, to come to know all the true goods within my power. For our will is determined to follow or avoid anything only because our understanding presents it as good or bad. It is enough to judge well to act well, and to judge as best one can to act likewise as best one can. In other words, to acquire all virtues and with them all possible goods, and when one is certain of this, one cannot help but be content. Having thus established these maxims, which combined with the truths of faith that have always been foremost in my belief, I thought I could freely begin to rid myself of all my other opinions. I hoped to obtain the best by conversing with men, by stepping out of the study where I had meditated on all these thoughts, to resume my journey before winter was completely over. For the next 9 years, I did nothing but travel the world, trying to be more a spectator than an actor in the dramas played out there, and making particular reflections on everything that could seem suspect and liable to deceive us. During this time, I succeeded in ridding my mind of all the errors that might have crept in earlier, not by imitating the skeptics who doubt merely for the sake of doubting and always pretend to be undecided. On the contrary, my aim was not other than to strengthen myself in the truth, by removing the unstable ground and sand to reach solid rock or clay. In my opinion, I succeeded quite well. by attempting to discover the falsehood or uncertainty of the proportions I examined, not by weak conjectures, but by clear and certain reasoning. I found none so doubtful that I couldn't draw a fairly certain conclusion from it, even if it was simply that it contained nothing certain. Thus, as when demolishing an old house, one keeps the materials that serve to rebuild the new one, similarly, in destroying all those opinions I judged unfounded, I observed and acquired experiences that later served to establish more certain ones. I continued to practice the method I had prescribed for myself. Not only did I generally guide my thoughts according to the mentioned rules, but from time to time I spent a few hours putting them into practice, especially in mathematical difficulties or in other subjects similar to mathematics, by separating the principles of other sciences that did not seem sufficiently solid to me. All this can be seen in several questions explained in this same volume. Therefore, living apparently like those who have no other occupation but to lead a sweet and carefree life, and who imagine separating pleasures from vices to enjoy their leisure, I did not cease to persist in my purpose, and to benefit for the knowledge of the truth, even if that did not content me with reading books or frequenting literary circles. However, during these 9 years, without making any decision regarding the difficulties on which scholars generally dispute, and without having begun to seek the foundations of a philosophy more certain than the common one, the example of several excellent minds who tried to do so, without succeeding in my opinion, made me think that it was a task of such difficulty that I might not have dared to undertake it if I had not seen that some were preparing the ground by pretending to have accomplished it. I cannot say on what foundations this opinion was based, and if I contributed to it through my words, it would be by confessing my ignorance with more candor than those who have studied a little often do. Perhaps I also revealed the reasons to doubt many things that others consider certain, but not because I claim to possess a doctrine. But having enough heart not to appear other than I am, I thought it necessary to seek by all means to make myself worthy of the reputation given to me. Thus, precisely 8 years ago, this desire decided me to distance myself from all the places where I might have some acquaintances, and retreating here to a country where the long duration of the war has established orders that seem to maintain the armies, so that men can enjoy the fruits of peace with increased security. Amidst the crowd of a bustling city, more attentive to its own affairs than to those of others, I could live as solitary and secluded as in the most remote desert. I don't know if I should tell you about the first meditations I made there, for they are purely metaphysical and so uncommon that they might not please everyone. However, so that one may appreciate whether the foundations I have laid are solid enough, I feel somewhat obliged to say something about these reflections. After noticing that in matters of customs, it is sometimes necessary to follow opinions that we know to be very uncertain, as if they were indisputable, which has already been said in the previous part. Wishing this time to devote myself solely to seeking the truth, I thought that I should do the opposite, reject as absolutely false everything in which I could imagine the slightest doubt, in order to see if, once this was done, there would remain in my belief something that was entirely indubitable. Since our senses sometimes deceive us, I assume that there is nothing in the imagination that conforms to reality. And since there are men who are mistaken in reasoning even on the simplest questions of geometry, I judge that I was just as exposed to error as anyone else. Therefore, I rejected as false all the reasons that I had previously considered demonstrative. Finally, considering that all the thoughts that come to us awake also occur in our dreams, without any being true at that time, I resolved to pretend that everything that had entered my mind until then was no more true than the illusions of my dreams. However, I quickly noticed that by thinking in this way that everything is false, it was necessary that there be something that thinks, and observing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so firm and certain that even the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics could not shake it, I judged that I could hold it as indubitable, as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. I then carefully examined what I was, and realizing that I could suppose that I had no body, and that there was no world where I was, but that I could not deny that I was thinking, I realized that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was very firm and clear. I deduced from this that I was a substance whose entire essence or nature is to think, and that I do not need to be in a place nor depend on anything material. Thus, this reality that I am, that is to say, the soul by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body, and even easier to know than the body. After that, I reflected on what is necessary for a proposition to be true and certain. Having found a proposition, I think, therefore I am, that I knew to be true, I considered that I needed to know what this certainty consists of. I noted that the proposition, I think, therefore I am, is assured only because I see it very clearly. I therefore admitted as a general rule that the things we conceive very clearly and distinctly are all true. But there is a difficulty in discerning those that we conceive distinctly. Reflecting on all this, I realized that if I doubted, it was because my being was not perfect, for there is more perfection in knowing than in doubting. And then the idea came to me to investigate how I had learned to think of something more perfect than myself. I clearly realized that this must come from a nature actually more perfect, regarding the thoughts I had about various things external to me, such as the sky, the earth, the light, the heat, and many others. I was not really concerned with knowing where it came from, for in considering things that did not seem to me superior to myself, I could believe that if they were true, they were dependencies of my own nature, insofar as it possesses a certain perfection. If they were not true, they came from nothing, that is to say, they were in me because of a defect in myself. However, it could not be the same with the idea of a being more perfect than myself, for it was manifestly impossible that such an idea came from nothing. Moreover, there is no greater absurdity than to think that the more perfect comes from or depends on the less perfect, or even that something comes from nothing. Therefore, it could not come from myself either, so that there remained only the possibility that this idea had been placed in me by a nature truly more perfect than mine, and even possessing all the perfections that I could have. In short, this means God. Furthermore, if I recognized certain imperfections in myself, I was not the only being to exist. It was absolutely necessary that there be another more perfect being on whom I depended and from whom I had acquired all that I possessed. For if I were independent of any other being, to the point that what I possessed of perfection essentially came from myself, I could also, for the same reason, possess all the rest that I knew was lacking in me. Therefore, I am infinite, eternal, immutable, omniscient, omnipotent, possessing all the perfections that I could conceive in God. By virtue of the reasoning I have just done to know the nature of God, insofar as mind can know it, I was content to consider all the things of which I had an idea in myself, and to see if possessing them was or was not a perfection. I was sure that none of those indicating an imperfection was in God, but that all the others were in him. Thus I saw that doubt, uncertainty, sadness, and similar things could not be in God, for that would make him less perfect. Moreover, I had ideas of various sensitive and corporeal things. Even assuming that I was dreaming, and that everything I saw or imagined was false, I could not deny that these ideas were really in my mind. However, having already clearly understood that the intelligent nature is distinct from the corporeal nature, and considering that all composition indicates dependence, and that dependence is manifestly a defect, I therefore judged that it could not be a perfection in God to be composed of these two natures. Consequently, God was not composed. On the other hand, if there were bodies in the world, or even intelligences or other natures that were not totally perfect, their existence would have to depend on divine power to the point that they could not subsist without it even for an instant. Next, I wanted to examine other truths, and, having taken as my object what geometers consider, I conceived of myself as a continuous body, a space infinitely extended in length, width, height, or depth, divisible into several parts that can have different shapes and sizes and be moved or transferred in all directions. The geometers assume all this in their object. I reviewed some of their simplest demonstrations, and, having noticed that this great certainty attributed to these demonstrations is based solely on the fact that they are conceived clearly according to the aforementioned rule, I also noticed that there was nothing in them that assured me of the existence of their object. For example, I understood well that if we suppose a triangle, it is necessary that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, but I saw nothing that assured me that there actually was a triangle in the world. On the other hand, if I returned to examining the idea I had of a perfect being, I found that its existence was included in it in the same way that the equality of its 3 angles to 2 right angles is included in the idea of a triangle, or that the fact that all its parts are equally distant from the center is included in the idea of a sphere. This idea was therefore more evident and consequently as certain as that of a geometrical demonstration. However, if there are some who think that it is difficult to know God and even the soul, it is because they never elevate their mind above sensible things and are so accustomed to considering everything with their imagination. It is a particular mode of thinking for material things that what is not imaginable seems unintelligible to them, which is quite evident in the principle that philosophers themselves admit as true in the schools, affirming that there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. However, it is true that the ideas of God and the soul have never been in the senses. It seems to me that those who want to use their imagination to understand these ideas are like those who, to hear sounds and smell odors, use their eyes. Moreover, there is this difference between these and those. Sight does not assure us less of the truth of its objects than smell and hearing for theirs, whereas neither the imagination nor the senses can ever assure us of anything without the intervention of the intellect. Finally, if there are still men whom the reasons I have advanced have not sufficiently convinced of the existence of God and the soul, I want them to know that all the other things they can consider as more certain, such as having a body, the existence of the stars, the earth, and similar things, are nevertheless less certain. For we have a moral certainty of these things so great that it seems that unless we are extravagant, no one can doubt them. However, when it comes to metaphysical certainty, it cannot be denied without losing reason, given that the mere fact of noting that we can dream in the same way that we perceive other bodies, other stars, and other lands without it being true, leads us to think that if our thoughts often contain lies, it is because there is something confused and obscure in them, and that as such they participate in nothingness. That is to say, if they are so confused among us, it is because we are not totally perfect, and it is evident that there is no less absurdity in admitting that lies or imperfection proceed from God Himself than in admitting that truth and perfection proceed from nothingness. However, if we did not know that everything that is real and true in us comes from a perfect and infinite being, then, even if our ideas are clear and distinct, there would be no reason to assure us of their perfection as true. Thus, by opening ourselves to the knowledge of God and the soul, testifying to the certainty of this principle, it becomes quite easy to recognize that the dreams we imagine when we sleep should in no way make us doubt the truth of the thoughts we have awake. For if a person has a very clear and distinct idea in a dream, like that of inventing a geometer, it should not prevent it from being true. As for the most common error, that of representing various objects to ourselves in the same way that we perceive them by our external senses, we should not be troubled by this idea regarding the truth of these concepts. Indeed, our senses can also frequently deceive us while awake, as when we see everything yellow due to jaundice, or when the stars and other very distant bodies appear much smaller than they really are. Thus, whether awake or asleep, we should never be persuaded except by the evidence of reason, and it is important to note that I speak of reason, not imagination nor senses. For example, even if we see the sun very clearly, this should not lead us to judge that it has the size we perceive. We can very well imagine a lion's head attached to a goat's body without concluding that the chimera exists in the world. For reason does not tell us that what we see or imagine is true, but it tells us that all our ideas must have some foundation in truth. Indeed, it would be impossible for God, who is perfect and true, to instill them in us without this. And since our reasonings are never as evident and complete as when we dream we are awake, if sometimes our imaginations are so vivid and expressive, even more so in dreams than when awake, this is why reason tells us that since not all our thoughts can be true because we are not totally perfect, the truth must be found, to be honest, more in those we think awake than in those we have while sleeping. I would very much like to continue and outline here the chain of other truths that I have deduced from these first ones. But as this would require discussing various questions that are controversial among scholars, and since I do not wish to quarrel with them, I believe it is better to refrain and be content with saying in general what these truths are, leaving it to others wiser than I to judge whether it would be useful for the public to receive more extensive and in-depth information. I have always firmly maintained my resolution not to assume any other principle than that which served to demonstrate the existence of God and the soul, and to accept as true only those things that seem to me clearer and more certain than the demonstrations of the geometers. Nevertheless, I allow myself to say that not only have I found a way to quickly resolve the main difficulties often discussed in philosophy, but I have also observed certain laws that God has established in nature, whose notions are so deeply imprinted in our souls that if we reflect on them attentively, we cannot doubt that they are realized exactly in everything that exists or happens in the world. Then, considering the sequence of these laws, it seems to me that I have discovered several truths more useful and more important than anything I had learned before, or even hoped to learn. Having tried to explain the main ones in a treatise that for certain reasons I cannot publish, it would be preferable to make its content known, to briefly outline here what this treatise contains. I undertook to put in it everything I believed I knew before writing it about the nature of material things. But like painters who, unable to represent equally all the different faces of a solid object, choose one of the principal ones to turn towards the light and depict the others in shadow. That is to say, as they can be seen when one looks at the principal one. In the same way, fearing that I could not include in my discourse everything that was in my thoughts, I had to limit myself to explaining very broadly my conception of light. Then, taking advantage of this opportunity, I added something about the sun and the fixed stars, for almost all the light comes from these celestial bodies, which transmit it to the planets, comets, and the earth which reflect it, and in particular to all bodies on earth, whether they are colored, transparent, or luminous, and finally to man, who is the observer. In order to cast a bit of shadow over all these things and to be able to declare my judgments more freely, without the obligation to follow or refute the opinions received among scholars, I decided to leave this world to its quarrels and speak only of what happens in another new world, if God now grants enough matter to the imaginary spaces to compose it, and by variously mixing and without order the different parts of this matter to form a chaos as confused as the poets can feign, then to let his natural law act, letting it operate according to the laws he has established. Thus, I first described this matter and tried to represent it in such a way that in my opinion nothing is clearer or more understandable, except what we have said before about God and the soul. I even expressly supposed that there were none of those forms or qualities disputed by the schools in it, nor in general any other thing whose knowledge is not so natural to our souls that one could not even pretend to ignore it. I then examined what the laws of nature were, and without basing my reasoning on any other principle than the infinite perfections of God, I tried to demonstrate all that could be subject to doubt, and sought to prove that these laws are such that even if God had created several worlds, one could not find a single one in which they would not be observed. Then I showed how the majority of the matter of this chaos, by virtue of these laws, had to arrange and organize itself in a certain manner that made it similar to our heavens, while some parts of it were to form a earth, and others planets and comets, and still others a sun and fixed stars. Continuing on the subject of light, I detailed how it must exist in the sun and stars, how it traversed instantaneously the immense spaces of the heavens, and how it reflected from planets and comets towards the earth. I also added some elements concerning the substance, situation, movements, and all the various qualities of these heavens and stars, so that I thought I had said enough to understand that each thing observed in this world of ours should not, or at least cannot, appear entirely similar to those of this other world I described. Next, I proceeded to speak particularly of the earth, explaining how even assuming explicitly that the Creator did not give weight to the matter of which it is composed, all its parts did not cease to move exactly towards the center. Then, having water and air on its surface, The arrangement of the heavens and stars, primarily of the moon, should cause an ebb and flow similar in all circumstances to what is observed in our seas, and also a certain current, both of water and air, rising in the west, like that also observed at the tropics. Mountains, seas, springs and rivers could naturally form, metals produced in mines, and plants grow in fields, and in general generate all those bodies called mixtures or compounds. Among other things, knowing after the stars nothing else in the world produces light other than fire, I made efforts to clearly understand everything about its nature, how it is produced, how it is nourished, how sometimes it produces heat without light and sometimes light without heat, how it can give different colors to different bodies and other qualities, how it melts some and hardens others, how it can reduce most to ashes and smoke, and finally how from these ashes it forms only through the violence of its action glass, for this transmutation of ashes into glass seemed to me as admirable as any other in nature. So I took particular pleasure in describing it. However, despite all these things, I did not want to deduce that our world was created in the manner I explained, for it is much more likely that from the beginning God placed it as it should be. But it is true, and this opinion is commonly accepted among theologians, that the action by which God observes it is the same as that by which he created it, so that even if he had not given from the beginning a form other than that of chaos, by establishing in it the laws of nature, and by lending his assistance to act as it is accustomed to do, one can believe without compromising the miracle of creation that all purely material things could, over time, develop as we now see them. Their nature is much easier to conceive when seen gradually born in this way than when considered as already fully made. The description of inanimate bodies and plants led me to that of animals, and particularly to that of humans. However, not yet having enough knowledge to speak of them in the same style as other beings, that is, demonstrating effects through causes, and showing from what seeds and in what manner nature must produce them, I limited myself to assuming that God formed a man entirely similar to one of ours, both in external figure and its members, and in the internal constitution of its organs. This without giving him initially a rational soul or any other thing serving as a vegetative or sensitive soul, but by stirring in his heart one of those fires without light already explained by me, and which I conceived of the same nature as that which warms the enclosed hay before it is dry, or that which boils the new wines when allowed to ferment in their old ones. In examining the functions resulting from this body, I found them to be exactly the same as those that can occur in us without our awareness, and therefore without our soul, meaning that distinct part of the body whose nature is solely to think, as mentioned earlier, contributing in any way. Since these functions are the same, one can say that animals devoid of reason resemble us, but conversely, none of those that depend on thought, which are the only ones that belong to us as human beings, are found in our body. I then found these functions by assuming that God created a rational soul and added it to the body as I have described. But in order for one to see how this matter was treated, I will explain here the movement of the heart and arteries, the first and most general observed in animals, which will serve to easily judge subsequently what one should think of all the other movements, and to make the understanding of what I am going to say easier, I would like those who are not well versed in anatomy to take the trouble, before reading this, to have the heart of a large animal with lungs cut open in front of them, for in all such animals it closely resembles that of man. Let them observe the two chambers or cavities found there, that on the right side, where very large tubes converge to form the vena cava, the main receptacle of blood, like the trunk of a tree whose branches are the other veins of the body, and the pulmonary artery, whose name is poorly given because it is actually an artery that leaves the heart and then divides into several branches that spread through the lungs in all directions. Then that on the left side, where similarly two tubes as large or larger than the previous ones converge, you will see the venous artery, whose name is also poorly attributed because it is merely a vein originating from the lungs, where it divides into several branches, intermingled with those of the pulmonary artery, and the duct called the pulmonary canal, through which respiratory air enters, and the large artery that leaves the heart and distributes its branches throughout the body. I would also like you to look closely at the 11 small skins that, like as many solid valves, close the 4 openings of these 2 cavities, namely 3 at the entrance of the vena cava, so well arranged that they cannot in any way prevent blood from entering the right cavity of the heart, but they precisely prevent it from exiting. 3 at the entrance of the pulmonary artery, arranged oppositely. They allow blood from this cavity to pass to the lungs, but prevent it from returning from the lungs to the cavity. 2 at the entrance of the venous artery, which allow blood to pass from the lungs to the left cavity of the heart, but oppose its return in the other direction. And 3 at the entrance of the large artery, which allow blood to leave the heart, but prevent it from returning. As for the number of valves, there is no other reason than the oval shape of the venous artery orifice, which can be conveniently closed with 2, whereas the others, being circular, close better with 3. Furthermore, consider that the large artery and pulmonary artery are made of a composition much harder and more solid than the venous artery and vena cava, and that these last 2 widen before entering the heart, forming 2 pouches called atria of the heart, composed of flesh similar to this, and that there is always more heat in the heart than in any other part of the body. Finally, that this heat is capable of causing a few drops of blood entering its cavities to immediately swell and expand, as generally occurs to all liquids when they fall drop by drop into a very hot vessel. That being said, it suffices to add to explain the movement of the heart, that when the cavities are not filled with blood, blood necessarily enters from the vena cava into the right cavity, from the venous artery into the left cavity, especially since these 2 vessels are always full, and their openings turned towards the heart, cannot then be obstructed. But as soon as 2 drops of blood thus enter each cavity, these drops, which are very thick on the outside because the orifices through which they enter are very wide, and the 2 vessels from which they come are very full of blood, dilate and open due to the heat where they fall, causing them to swell the entire heart, push and close the 5 valves located at the entrance of the 2 vessels from which they come, thus preventing the blood from descending further into the heart. Then they continue to dilate more and more, pushing and opening 6 other valves located at the entrance of the 2 other vessels through which they then exit, thereby producing swelling in all branches of the pulmonary artery and the large artery almost simultaneously with the heart, which deflates very rapidly, as do its arteries because the blood that has entered cools and the 6 valves close, and the 5 of the vena cava and venous artery reopen, allowing 2 more drops of blood that in turn swell the heart and arteries as before, and because the blood before entering the heart passes through these 2 sacs called atria of the heart. This is how the movement of these parts is opposite to that of the latter, and how the latter deflates while the former inflates. Moreover, so that those who know the power of mathematical demonstrations and who are not in the habit of distinguishing true reasons from probable ones do not dare to deny what I say without examining it, I wish to point out to them that the movement I have just explained necessarily results from the sole arrangement of the organs visible in the heart, and from the heat that can be felt on this region with the fingers, as well as from the nature of the blood, which through experience can be observed. Just as the movement of a clock derives from the strength of its structure and the shape of its counterweights and gears. But if one wonders why the blood from the veins does not dry up when it continually enters the heart, and why the arteries do not fill excessively, since all the blood passing through the heart comes from them, I need not answer anything other than what has already been written by an English physician, to whom credit must be given for opening the way on this point and for being the first to teach that there are, at the ends of the arteries, several small vessels through which the blood from the heart passes into the smallest ramifications of the veins, to then return to the heart. Thus, the course of blood is a continuous circular movement, which is convincingly proven by the usual experience of surgeons, who by ligating the arm with moderate force above the site where the vein opens, cause a more abundant flow of blood than if they had not ligated the arm. The opposite would result if they ligated it lower down, between the hand and the arm, or if they tightened it firmly above, because it is evident that moderate tightening can prevent the blood present in the arm from returning to the heart through the veins, but not that new blood flows through the arteries, as these pass underneath the veins and, being provided with more rigid skins, are less easy to compress. Furthermore, the blood coming from the heart tends more strongly to pass through the arteries towards the hand than to return from the hand to the heart through the veins. There must be some passages under the ligature, that is to say, towards the ends of the arm, through which the blood can come from the arteries. Likewise, the particular arrangement of valves along the veins, which does not allow blood to move from the central parts of the body towards the extremities, but only to return from the extremities to the center, very well proves the course of blood. Moreover, experience demonstrates that all the blood present in the body can flow out in a short time through a single artery that has been cut, even when the artery has been ligated very close to the heart, and the cut has been made between this ligation and the heart, in such a way that there is no other conceivable source for the spilled blood. But there are many other elements that attest that the true cause of this movement of blood is that which I have explained. For example, the observed difference between the blood from the veins and that from the arteries, a difference that can only be explained by the fact that the blood, after being purified and, so to speak, distilled during its passage through the heart, is more subtle, livelier, and warmer upon leaving it, that is, while in the arteries, than shortly before entering it, that is, when in the veins. Upon closer examination, one will find that this difference is not fully noticeable except near the heart, and not so much in the most distant places. Furthermore, the rigidity of the skin that composes the arteries and the large artery is evidence that blood is directed with more force towards the arteries rather than towards the veins. Moreover, why are the left cavity of the heart and the large artery wider and more spacious than the right cavity and the arterial vein, if not because the blood from the venous artery, which has only been in the lungs before passing through the heart, is subtler and dilates more readily than that which comes directly from the vena cava? Physicians can observe by taking the pulse that if the nature of the blood changes, the heat of the heart can retain it with more or less force or more or less speed. If we examine how this heat is communicated to the other members, we must agree that it is through the blood, which, passing through the heart, warms up and is then distributed throughout the body. Hence, if we withdraw blood from a part, we also withdraw the heat, and even if the heart burned like a glowing iron, it would not be sufficient to warm the feet and hands as if it did not also send fresh blood next to these parts. Furthermore, this is how we recognize that the true purpose of respiration is to introduce into the lungs sufficient fresh air so that the blood coming from the right cavity of the heart, where it has been diluted and transformed into vapors, thickens and returns to blood before going back to the left cavity. Without this, it could not serve as fuel for the fire that is in this cavity. A confirmation of this is that we see that animals that do not have lungs have a single cavity in the heart, and that infants who, being in the maternal womb, cannot use their lungs, have an opening through which the blood passes from the vena cava to the left cavity of the heart, and a canal through which it goes from the iliac vein to the large artery without passing through the lung. Moreover, how could food be cooked in the stomach if the heart did not send heat to that organ through the arteries, adding softer parts of the blood that help dissolve food? The action that transforms the juice of these foods into blood is not easy to understand when considering that, with each passage through the heart, the blood dilates perhaps more than 100 or 200 times a day. To explain nutrition and the production of various noises in the body, what other necessity is there than to say that the force with which the blood, by dilating, passes from the heart to the extremities of the arteries causes some of its parts to stop between the parts of the limbs where they are found, taking the place of other parts that they expel. Depending on the situation, shape, or smallness of the pores they encounter, some will lodge in certain places, others in others, just as fibers do, which, being perforated in various ways, are used to separate grains of various sizes. Finally, the most remarkable thing in all this is the generation of animal spirits, which are like a subtle and extremely pure wind, or rather like a very pure and lively flame, which continually rises very abundantly from the heart to the brain, then spreads into the limbs, muscles, putting all members in motion. To explain how the most agitated and penetrating parts of the blood are directed towards the brain more than any other place, it is not necessary to imagine another cause than that of the arteries that leave in straight lines, according to the mechanical rules that are the same as those of nature. when several things tend to move towards the same side without there being enough space for all to receive them, as is the case with the parts of the blood leaving the left cavity of the heart and all tending towards the brain. The strongest must oust the weaker and less agitated. This is why only the strongest ones arrive. I had explained in sufficient detail all these things in the treatise I intended to publish. Then I had shown what must be the structure of the nerves and muscles of the human body, so that the animal spirits being inside have enough strength to move the limbs as we see the heads move and bite the ground shortly after being cut off, even if they are no longer alive. What changes must occur in the brain to cause wakefulness, sleep and dreams? How light, sounds, colors, flavors, heat and other qualities of external objects can imprint different ideas in the brain through the senses. How hunger, thirst and other internal passions can also send their impressions there. All this must be understood by common sense, in which these ideas are received, then modified by memory, imagined differently by fantasy to compose new ideas. Likewise, fantasy can distribute animal spirits into the muscles and set the members of the body in motion by adapting objects that appear to the senses and internal passions in all possible ways. These movements that our body can perform without the will guiding them will not seem in any way strange to those who, knowing how many automata or mobile machines can be built by human industry, using very few parts compared to the large quantity of bones, muscles, nerves, arteries, veins, and other parts present in the body of an animal. Consider this body as a machine made by the hands of God, infinitely better ordered and possessing more admirable movements than any that humans can invent. And here, I have particularly expanded to show that if there were machines possessing the organs and external appearance of a rational animal, there would be no way to allow us to recognize that they are not entirely of the same nature as animals. However, if there were machines that resemble our bodies and imitate our actions as much as morally possible, we would always have two very certain ways to recognize that they are not real human beings. The first is that they will never be able to use words or other signs to compose discourses as we do to express our thoughts to others. One can conceive of a machine being constructed in such a way that it prefers words or even bodily actions that cause an alteration in its organs. For example, if touched in one place, it asks what is meant, or if touched elsewhere, it cries out that it is hurt and other such things. However, one cannot conceive how, in various ways, words could respond to the meaning of everything said in its presence, as even the most stupid among men do. The second is that even if they performed various actions, and perhaps better than any of us, they would fail in others, thus revealing that they do not act from knowledge, but only from the arrangement of their organs. Whereas reason is a universal instrument that can serve in all circumstances, these organs require a particular disposition for each specific action. Therefore, it is morally impossible that there should be as many varied dispositions in a machine to enable it to act in all situations of life as reason allows us. Thus, by these two means, one can equally recognize the difference between men and beasts. It is very remarkable to note that there is no man, however stupid and doltish, except for the insane, who is incapable of putting together several words and composing a discourse to express his thoughts. On the other hand, there is no animal, however perfectly gifted and happy it may be, that can do the same. This is not because animals lack organs, for we see that magpies and parrots can utter words like us, but they cannot speak like us, meaning they cannot give the impression of thinking what they say. In contrast, humans born deaf and mute, deprived of the organs that serve to speak, can invent signs by themselves to communicate with those who have learned their language. This proves not only that animals have less reason than humans, but that they have none at all, for it is evident that very little reason suffices to know how to speak. Supposing there were inequalities among animals of the same species, some being easier to train than others, one cannot believe that a monkey or a parrot, perfect in its species, could not equal one of the most stupid children, or at least a child whose brain is disturbed, unless its soul were of a totally different nature from ours. One must not confuse words with natural movements that betray passions, for these movements can be imitated by machines as well as by animals. Nor should one think, as some ancients did, that beasts speak but we do not understand their language. If that were true, since they possess various organs similar to ours, they could make themselves understood by us as well as by their own kind. It is also very remarkable that even though there are several animals that demonstrate more ingenuity than us in some of their actions, we nevertheless see that they show none in many others. Thus, what they do better than us does not prove they have ingenuity, for in that case, they would have more than any of us and do better than us in all other things. On the contrary, it rather proves that they have none at all, and it is nature that acts in them through the arrangement of their organs, as we see with a clock composed of gears and springs, which can count the hours and measure time more precisely than we with all our prudence. After all this, I had described the rational soul and shown that it cannot in any way derive from the power of matter, like the other things I have spoken of, but that it must be expressly created. It is not enough that it is lodged in the human body like a pilot in his ship, unless perhaps to move its members, but it is necessary that it be joined and united to the body in a closer manner to have feelings and appetites similar to ours and thus compose a true person. Furthermore, I have extended somewhat on the subject of the soul here because it is one of the most important after the error of those who deny God, an error that I think I have sufficiently refuted in what precedes. Nothing more separates weak minds from the right path of virtue than imagining that the soul of animals is of the same nature as ours, and that therefore after this life we have nothing to fear or hope for, just as flies and ants fear and hope for nothing. However, if we know how different we are from animals, we will better understand the reasons that prove that our soul is of a nature entirely independent of the body, and therefore not subject to dying with it. And since we see no other cause of its destruction, we would naturally be inclined to judge that it is immortal. 3 years ago I reached the end of the treatise where all these things are set forth, and I began to revise it for publication, when I learned that certain persons, whom I respect, and whose authority is as powerful over my actions as my own reason is over my thoughts, had rejected an opinion in physics published shortly before by another. I do not say that I held this opinion, but only that I had noticed nothing harmful in it before seeing it criticized, neither to religion nor to the state, and consequently nothing would have prevented me from writing it if reason had persuaded me to do so. This made me fear finding something similar in my own writings, where I might have erred. However, in the great care I have always taken not to admit into my belief any new opinion not founded on clear demonstrations, and not to write anything that could harm others, this was sufficient to change my resolution to publish this treatise. Even if the reasons that had prompted me to make this resolution before were very strong, my natural aversion to the profession of writing immediately provided me with other excuses, and these reasons on both sides not only interest me in saying them, but may also interest the public in knowing them. I have never attached much value to things that emanate from my mind, and as long as I have not drawn any other fruit from the method I have used than to resolve certain difficulties peculiar to speculative sciences or to direct my habits according to the principles that this method has taught me, I have not felt obliged to write anything. As for habits, each person is so abundant in his own sense that one could count as many reformers as there are men, if everyone, not just those whom God has established as sovereigns of their people, or those to whom he has given the grace and sufficient zeal to be prophets, were authorized to modify something. As for my speculations, though they were to my taste, I thought that others might have others perhaps more agreeable. But as soon as I acquired some general notions of physics and began to test them in several particular difficulties, then noticing how far they can lead us and how different they are from the principles that have been used up to now, I believed that keeping them secret was a very great sin, transgressing the law which obliges us to seek the general good of all men as far as we can. For these notions have taught me that it is possible to attain very useful knowledge for life. Instead of the speculative philosophy taught in schools, it is possible to find a practice by means of which, by understanding the force and actions of fire, water, air, stars, heavens, and all the other bodies around us, as distinctly as we know the various trades of our artisans, we could use them in the same manner in all the uses that belong to them. Thus we could become like masters and owners of nature, which is very desirable, not only for inventing a multitude of devices that would enable us to enjoy without any effort, the fruits of the earth and all the conveniences found there, but also mainly for the preservation of health, which is undoubtedly the first good and foundation of the other goods of this life. For the mind itself depends so much on the temperament and disposition of the organs of the body that if it is possible to find a way to make men generally wiser and stronger than they have been up to now, I believe it is in medicine that we should look for it. It is true that the medicine used at present contains few things of remarkable utility, but without wanting to denigrate it, I am certain that there is no one, even among those who have made it their profession, who does not confess how little is known in this science compared to what remains to be discovered. We could rid ourselves of a multitude of diseases, both of body and mind, and perhaps even of the weakness that old age brings, if we had enough knowledge of their causes and all the remedies that nature has provided us. And as I had conceived the design of devoting my whole life to the pursuit of this science so necessary, and as I had found a path that seemed to me to lead infallibly to it, unless the brevity of life or the lack of experiments hindered it, there is no better remedy against these two obstacles than to faithfully communicate to the public what little I may have discovered. I invite good minds to continue, each contributing according to his inclination and strength to the experiments that need to be done, and communicating to the public everything they discover, so that, starting where others have finished by thus combining the lives and labors of many, we may all together go much further than any individual could alone. I also observe regarding experiments that they are all the more necessary the further we advance in knowledge, for it is preferable to begin by using those that present themselves to our senses and that we cannot ignore no matter how much reflection we bring to them, than to seek other more rare and studied experiments. The reason for this is that the latter often deceive us if we do not already know the causes of the former, more common ones, and the circumstances on which they depend are almost always so particular and so small that they are very difficult to notice. My approach to all this has been as follows. First, I sought to find in general the principles or first causes of everything that is or can be in the world, without considering for this purpose anything other than God alone who created it, and to derive from this no other origin than certain seeds of truths that are naturally within our souls. Then I examined what are the first and most ordinary effects that can result from these causes. It seems to me that in this way I have discovered certain heavens, stars, earth, and even on the earth water, air, fire, minerals, and other things, which being the most common and simplest of all, are also the easiest to know. Next, when I wanted to delve into the more specific, so many forms and varieties appeared to me that I did not believe it possible for the human mind to distinguish the forms or species of bodies present on earth among so many others that could be found there, if it had been God's will to place them there. Consequently, it is also not possible to bring them into our service unless we meet the causes through their effects and make use of various specific experiences. As a result, I had to review in my mind all the objects that had appeared to me through my senses, and I did not hesitate to assert that nothing was lacking to explain them properly by means of the principles I had discovered. However, I must also admit that the power of nature is so vast and so general, and these principles are so simple and so universal, that I hardly notice any particular effect without immediately knowing what can result from it in different ways. My greatest difficulty lies in knowing by which of these ways this effect depends on the principles, and I know of no other remedy for this difficulty than to seek some experiments that are such that the effect does not occur in the same way if the explanation to be given is this one or that one. I have come to the point where I see quite clearly, in my opinion, the way forward to carry out most of the experiments that could serve these effects, but I also see that they are so numerous and so diverse that neither my hands nor my resources, even if I had 1,000 times more than I do, would suffice for all of them. Therefore, depending on whether the convenience is greater or lesser, so will be my progress in the knowledge of nature. All this I intended to make known in the treatise I had written, demonstrating so clearly the utility that the public could derive from it, in a way that would compel all those who desire the general good of humanity, and all those who are truly virtuous and not merely by false appearance and simple opinion, to share with me the experiences they have had, and to assist me in the search for those that remain to be done. But since then, other reasons have made me change my mind and made me think that I should indeed continue to write everything that I judge to be of some importance as I discover its truth, putting as much care into it as if I were to print it, not only because I would thus have more space to examine it well, for without a doubt one looks more attentively at what others must examine than what one does for oneself, and many things that seemed true to me when I conceived them, I discovered to be false when I put them down on paper, but also not to miss the opportunity to serve the public, if I am truly capable of doing so. For although every man is bound to seek the good of others as much as he can, and is worth nothing if he serves no one, it is also true that our concerns extend beyond the present, and it is good to set aside certain things that might perhaps be useful to those who live now, to make others that will be even more useful to our grandchildren. Indeed, it is good to know that what little I have learned so far is almost nothing compared to what I do not know. And I have no doubt that those who gradually discover the truth in the sciences undergo almost the same thing as those who begin to grow rich. It is easier for them, being already a little wealthy, to make great acquisitions than before, when they were poor, to gather small gains. They can also be compared to generals who believe in their strengths as they win battles. They need more attention and effort to maintain themselves after a defeat than to capture cities and conquer provinces after a victory. Truly, seeking to overcome all the difficulties and errors that prevent us from reaching the knowledge of truth is like fighting battles. Admitting false opinions on a somewhat general and important subject is like losing a battle. Then it takes much more skill to return to the same state as before, than to undertake great projects when one already has well-established principles. As for me, if I have succeeded in discovering some truths in the sciences, and I believe this volume will demonstrate that I have found some, I can say that they are only the consequences and dependencies of 5 main difficulties that I have resolved. I consider them as many battles where luck has smiled upon me. I would even dare say that I think I need only 2 or 3 of these victories to achieve my goals, and that I am not so old that I cannot, according to the natural course of things, still have the time necessary for this. But for this very reason, I feel all the more obliged to economize the time remaining to me, all the more so, as I have great hopes of being able to employ it usefully. Without a doubt, there would be many occasions to waste it if I were to make public the foundations of my physics, even if these foundations are so evident that understanding them is enough to believe them, and there is not a single one that cannot be demonstrated, however, as it is impossible for them to agree with all the varied opinions of other men. I foresee that they would arouse oppositions that would distract me a little from my work. One could object to this by saying that these oppositions would be useful not only because they would make me aware of my own shortcomings, but also because, if I have anything good in me, other men would gain a better understanding of my opinions through this means. And as many see better than the individual alone, if they were to begin immediately to use my principles, they would also help me with their own discoveries. However, although I know myself to be very exposed to error, to the point of almost never trusting the first thoughts that come to mind, however, the experience I have of the objections that could be made to me deprives me of any hope of benefiting from them. Often I have been able to examine the judgments of others, both those made by those I considered friends and those made by others whom I thought to be indifferent, or even those of some whom I knew that malice and jealousy would drive them to criticize what my friends had not succeeded in seeing. But it is rare that someone has raised something completely unexpected to me, except for something very far from my subject. Thus I have almost never found a censor of my opinions who seems to me neither less severe nor less fair than myself. Moreover, I have never found that the usual disputes in the schools serve to discover a truth hitherto unknown. For by each striving to defeat his opponent, one is more exercised in abandoning the probable, which consists of weighing the arguments on both sides. Moreover, those who have been good advocates for a long time have not necessarily become better judges. Regarding the utility that others could derive from the communication of my thoughts, it could not be very great until I have sufficiently developed these ideas so that they no longer need much addition before being put into practice. And I think, without vanity, that if anyone is capable of developing them, it is rather me than anyone else. not because I do not see in the world other minds far superior to mine, but because he who learns something from another cannot conceive and possess it as fully as he who invents it. This is particularly true in this domain. Having often explained some of my opinions to very intelligent people, they seemed to understand them very differently from what I said. Yet when they repeated them later, I often noticed that they had modified them to such an extent that I could no longer recognize them as mine. Therefore, I take this opportunity to ask our descendants never to believe that these are things that others tell them, unless I have disclosed them myself, and these extravagances attributed to the ancient philosophers, whose writings we do not possess, do not surprise me at all. Nor do they make me judge their thoughts to be so absurd. Since these men were the most eminent minds of their time, I simply think that their opinions were misreported on their behalf. We almost always find that those who followed the doctrines of these great minds did not surpass the master. I am certain that those who most zealously follow Aristotle would consider themselves fortunate to possess a knowledge of nature such as he had, even if they were to remain forever without acquiring a broader knowledge. They are like ivy that cannot climb higher than the trees to which it clings. Often it descends after reaching the summit. It also seems to me that those who follow a foreign doctrine descend, that is to say, they become somewhat less knowledgeable than if they refrained from studying. These individuals, not content with knowing everything their author explains clearly, also want to find in him the solution to several difficulties he does not address, and which he may never have considered. Nevertheless, this way of philosophizing is very convenient for those who possess very mediocre minds, because the obscurity of the distinctions and principles used allows them to speak about everything with as much boldness as if they knew, and to support everything they say against the most skilled and subtle without any means of convincing them. This seems to me to be similar to a blind person who, to fight on equal terms against a sighted person, would have been taken into a deep and darkened cave. I can say that these individuals have an interest in my not publishing the principles of my philosophy. For being very simple and obvious, publishing them would be like opening windows and bringing light into the cave where they have gone to fight. The more eminent minds would also not need to want to know them, because if they wish to speak about everything and acquire the reputation of being learned, they will achieve this more easily by contenting themselves with what is probable, which can be found without great effort in all subjects. However, for those who seek the truth that reveals itself gradually in certain matters, and for whom, when found, it will require them to frankly acknowledge that they were ignorant of it, if they consider a small truth to be preferable to the vanity of appearing to know everything, which is indeed preferable, and if they want to undertake something similar to me, they do not need me to tell them more than what I have already mentioned in this discourse. For if they are capable of continuing my work, they will be all the more capable of discovering by themselves everything that I think I have found. Not to mention that, having always followed my own research, what remains for me to discover is surely more difficult and hidden than what I have been able to find before. Therefore, they would take much less pleasure in learning it from me than in discovering it themselves. Moreover, the habit they will acquire by first seeking simple things and gradually moving on to more difficult things will be much more useful to them than all my instructions. I am myself convinced that if, at my current age, I had been taught all the truths for which I subsequently sought demonstrations, and if it had not cost me too much effort to learn them, perhaps I would know nothing else today, or at least I would never have acquired the habit and ease that I believe I have in finding new ones as I search for them. In short, if there exists in the world a task where no one can rival the one who started it, it is certainly the one that occupies me. It is true that for the experiments that could be useful for this work, one man alone cannot perform them all, but this man also cannot effectively use other hands than those of artisans or other individuals whom he could pay. For the hope of good remuneration is a very effective means for these workers to execute his instructions exactly, whereas those who would volunteer to help, out of curiosity or a desire to learn, would not be useful. Besides generally being more eager to promise than to fulfill their commitments and only making beautiful proposals never materialized, they would inevitably want to receive in return some explanations on certain difficulties, or at least obtain compliments and useless conversations, which, as short as the duration of these exchanges might be, would ultimately represent a real loss. As for the experiments already conducted by others, even if they wish to share them, something that those who call them secrets will never do, most of them are composed of so many circumstances or superfluous ingredients that it would be laborious for them to decipher what is true in them. Moreover, most would be poorly explained or even false, as their authors sought to align them with their own principles. If by chance there were any that could be useful, they would not save the time that I would have to invest in solving these questions. So, if there was someone in the world who could be assured that he is capable of discovering the greatest and most useful things for himself, and for this reason others strive in every way to help him achieve his projects, I do not see what more they could do than to contribute to financing the expenses of the necessary experiments and to prevent others from hindering his fellow workers. Not to mention that I am not presumptuous enough to promise extraordinary things, nor too filled with vain thoughts to believe that the public would be very interested in my projects. Likewise, I do not have a soul base enough to accept from others a favor that could be believed I did not deserve. All these considerations together were the reason why 3 years ago I did not want to publish the treatise that I had in my hands, and I even decided not to publish during my lifetime another work of as general a nature as this one, allowing to understand the foundations of my physics. However, since then, 2 other reasons have led me to include in this book particular essays and to report to the public on my actions and intentions. The first is that if I do not, some who have known that I intended to print certain writings might imagine that the reasons why I abstained from it are detrimental to my person. For even if I do not feel an excessive love for glory, and I would even go so far as to say that I hate it, to the extent that I consider it contrary to the tranquility that I appreciate most, I have never done anything to hide my actions as if they were crimes, nor taken many precautions to remain unknown. Not only because I believed it would harm me, but also because it would have caused me some concern that would have disturbed the perfect tranquility of my mind that I seek. Having always been indifferent between the concern of being known or not, I could not avoid a certain form of reputation that I acquired, and that is why I thought that I should do everything in my power to avoid at least that this reputation is bad. The second reason that prompted me to write this is that I see every day how my learning objective is increasingly delayed due to a multitude of experiments that are so essential to me that I cannot undertake them without the help of others. Although I do not consider myself of such great value to expect the public to take a significant part in my interests, I do not want to fail in what I owe to myself by giving those who will outlive me the opportunity to one day reproach me for having been able to leave much better things unfinished, if I had neglected too much to make them understand how and in what way they could contribute to my designs. I thought it was easy to choose certain subjects that, without causing great controversy or obliging me to declare my principles in more detail than I wish, would clearly enough show what I am capable or incapable of achieving in the sciences. On this point, I cannot say if I have been successful, because I do not want to anticipate anyone's judgments by speaking of my writings myself. However, I would greatly appreciate it if they were examined, and to provide a broader opportunity for this, I ask those who have objections to take the trouble to send them to my bookseller, who will forward them to me, and I will endeavor to respond in a manner that can be published along with the objections. In this way, readers, seeing both objections and responses, can more comfortably judge the truth. Because I promise that my responses will not be lengthy, and I will limit myself to admitting my errors frankly if I know them, and if I cannot recognize them, I will simply say what I believe is necessary to defend my writings, without adding further explanation on another subject, so as not to engage indefinitely in one another. If some of the things I mention at the beginning of optics and meteorology cause astonishment because I call them superstitions and do not seem willing to prove them, please have the patience to read everything carefully. I am convinced that you will find satisfaction, for it seems to me that the reasoning is so interconnected that as the latter are demonstrated by the former, which are their causes, these former in turn are proved by the latter, which are their effects. And I do not think I commit what logicians call a circle with this, for as experience shows that most of these effects are very certain, the causes from which I deduce them serve more to explain than to prove them. Conversely, these causes are proved by these effects, and if I have called them assumptions, it is to signify that I think I can deduce the former from the latter. It is true that I have explained myself in this discourse, but I expressly did not want to do so to avoid that certain minds, hearing only 2 or 3 words, imagine they know in a day what another has spent 20 years thinking, and who are all the more prone to error, incapable of discovering the truth, the more penetrating and agile they are. They might then take the opportunity to construct an extravagant philosophy on what they believe to be my principles, and then the fault would be attributed to me. Regarding the opinions that are entirely mine, I do not excuse them as new, for if one examines closely the reasons that support them, I am sure they will seem so simple and in accordance with common sense that they will appear less extraordinary and strange than any others that could be upheld on the same subjects. Nor do I boast of being the first inventor of any of them, but only of not having accepted them either because others have said them or because others have not said them, but only because reason has convinced me of their truth. If craftsmen cannot achieve in a good span of time the invention I explain in optics, it does not mean that it is bad, for just as it takes much skill and practice to manufacture and assemble the machines I have described without missing any circumstances, it would be as strange for them to succeed on the first attempt as if someone were to learn in a day to play a musical instrument perfectly simply by studying sheet music. If I write in French, which is the language of my country, rather than in Latin, which is the language used by my teachers, it is because I hope that those who use only their natural reason will judge my opinions better than those who believe only in ancient books. As for those who combine common sense and study, those alone whom I wish to be my judges, they will surely not be so biased in favor of Latin as to refuse to listen to my reasoning expressed in the vulgar tongue. Furthermore, I do not want to speak here specifically of the progress that I hope to achieve later in the sciences, nor to engage with the public by promising things of which I am not sure I can accomplish them, but I will only say that I have resolved to devote the time remaining to me in life to trying to acquire a knowledge of nature that can provide for medicine rules safer than those used so far. And my inclination moves me so far from any other purpose, especially those that cannot serve one without harming the other, that if some circumstances forced me to engage in these, I do not think I would be capable of carrying them out. I know well that this statement I make here will not serve to make me important in the world, but I have no desire to be. And I have always considered that I am more indebted to those who have made me the favor to help me enjoy my associates without obstruction than to those who offer me the most honorable charges on earth.